You are listening to KPMG's Energy Exchange podcast, a podcast where we explore the path to Ireland's exciting energy future. We'll discuss the practical things we can do to unlock the full potential of Ireland as a major energy producer. I'm Colm O'Neill, and today I am joined by David Kelly, who is the Executive Director of Customer and Business Development at Gas Networks Ireland. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Colm.
Thanks a million for coming into us here today. I thought might just kick off with maybe getting you to explain, the role that Gas Networks Ireland plays in the overall Irish energy system.
Okay. So our Gas Networks Ireland, you could argue, is 250 years old. It goes right back to when the gas mains were first used for lighting. And I suppose Bord Gáis, which more people are more familiar with, was established in the 1970s when there was a large natural gas field found off the coast of Kinsale. Since then, the business, through merger and through acquisition, has developed such that Gas Networks Ireland today owns and manages and operates the gas grid, which is 15,000 kilometres of pipeline infrastructure, and it's owned by the state. It's managed by the state, and Gas Networks Ireland is a commercial semi-state in that regard. So in the role of gas, very simply, gas today represents 30% of Ireland's total energy. The dominant player still being oil, 50%. 40% of Ireland's heat is derived from gas. But really interestingly, and quite pertinent to this discussion, the last 12 months you've seen a lot of discussion around energy security. 50% of Ireland's electricity is derived from gas, and that's a really important number. People, I think, are only waking up to that in recent months and years. It's been the case for quite a while, actually. But I think the outcome of the Russia-Ukraine situation and the realities around everyone across Europe, especially considering energy security, where does the energy come from? I think it's become a dawning reality that we're reliant on gas today. We're reliant on gas that ironically comes through a third country now. Since Brexit, 80% of Ireland's gas today comes from the UK. 20% of it comes from Colm, which has a lifetime probably of less than 10 years. So that's what the role that gas plays, but Gas Networks Ireland plays the role of managing all of that.
So it's fair to say you're pretty central to the energy system here in Ireland
today. Absolutely,
yeah. And if you look at that that energy system and the kind of the infrastructure that you own and operate on behalf of the state, can you maybe just describe physically where that exists and how it all fits together?
So the grid isn't all Ireland for a start, and that's something that certain politicians are disappointed at, because it traverses the main urban locations, but it doesn't, for example, exist in the northwest of the country, right through the Midlands and right across the coast, and generally a southern nature to it location-wise. The interconnectors, as you'd expect, are coming through the Irish Sea, and they arrive into North Dublin, and then we also have connectivity into the north. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that Gas Networks Ireland also has an entity, G&I UK, which is responsible for the infrastructure into Scotland, and we supply the gas into Northern Ireland and indeed the Isle of Man. So that was obviously a pertinent debate as part of the Brexit discussions. But it is pervasive. Certainly within urban locations, gas will be a dominant entity. It's subterranean, it's underground, and it's a bit like the electricity grid in that there's a transmission grid and there's a distribution grid.
Yeah.
Transmission grid, a bit like the large pylons you see with high voltage cables in electricity. These would be typically stainless steel pipes, high pressure, and they're transporting very large amounts of energy. And the distribution network is what you'd see coming into someone's house. Very well maintained, very safe. And the distribution network would be typically polyethylene, which is it's modern and it's safe, and it's that upgrade path over the last 20-30 years has meant that we now have a largely stainless steel transmission grid, and we have a largely stainless or polyethylene distribution network.
So these are big pieces of infrastructure when you consider those kind of transmission elements, complex to maintain, and then it goes out into a much broader distribution network that needs to be safe and secure. And that's the role that GNI plays.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to note, and it's something that probably again isn't understood, but when we have big weather events, and we're familiar with the beast from the east in the past, and Storm Ophelia and Storm Emma, these big events, because the nature of the network being underground, it's typically well protected. We absolutely need to ensure that there's power going to our above ground installations, and we have all the generators on site and so on. But it's a very reliable form of energy. It's a very reliable infrastructure. So much so that we have an offshoot business, Aurora Telecom, which is a fiber business, which runs alongside the gas infrastructure. And again, as of today, we have 100% uptime. That's unheard of in the broadband space. So it's an interesting infrastructure, but very, very important.
Yeah, and maybe if we put the infrastructure to one side now for a second and just consider gas as a part of the energy system. I always think conference season gives you a sense of how thinking is moving in an industry. And if I think of the conferences that would have been running this time last year, gas would have been a peripheral discussion item. You look at it this time this year, and gas has come center stage. Could you maybe just talk about that central role that gas plays?
Yeah, and it's probably one of the only fortunate outcomes from the Russia-Ukraine situation is that there's a better understanding now of how our energy system works. And certainly a dawning reality that gas is a key player, but it's also a key vector that is going to be necessary as we transition to a decarbonized future. I guess the reason...
Just develop that point a little bit, because it's a fossil fuel in terms of the gas that's flowing through our pipes. So how is that part of the decarbonisation of our...
So it's a fossil fuel. It isn't part of the long-term future. In fact, our vision and purpose within Gas Networks Ireland is to decarbonise and transform the business away from natural gas. We've done that before, by the way, back in the 1980s. And you might remember, you might be too young, Colm, the gasometer in Sir John Rogerson's Quay, that was full of town gas, which was gas that was derived from coal. And we moved from town gas to natural gas. The transition took years, but we did it. We're now transitioning from natural gas to biomethane immediately, and then to eventually hydrogen. And by the way, we're not doing that alone. We're doing that alongside all of the other transmission operators and distribution operators across Europe and beyond, because it's the right thing to do as part of our climate action agenda. But that's our core objective as Gas Networks Ireland now, is to decarbonise that grid.
So using the gas network as it stands, but then putting a different gas into it that is not a fossil fuel, but is a green gas.
Exactly. And it's going to take time. I mean, we're already today, and we have been since 2019, injecting biomethane into the existing gas grid. It has the same molecular qualities as natural gas. It's where it's derived from is the reason it's carbon neutral. So it's typically derived from anaerobic digestion facilities where waste food, farm waste, basically the material that is typically spread on land and causes all sorts of issues with nitrates and other impacts. It's put into an anaerobic digester. Think of it like a large composting bin. It's liquidated and it's put through the anaerobic digester, and then what comes from that process is biogas. That biogas then needs to be purified and conditioned such that it becomes biomethane, which is then injected or ready for injection into the grid.
And this is from the farming industry, basically?
Not just farming, all waste. And in fact, one of the sites run by Green Gas Generations in Nurney takes waste from one of the largest supermarket multiples in the country today. And they receive truckloads of this waste. This is food that wasn't sold. So it's then they take the packaging off it, they put the food product through a conveyor belt. A soup is created, and then that's put into an anaerobic digester.
Which then produces the gas.
Exactly, which is then injected and then used within the grid.
And how much are we getting from those types of processes today in terms of the percentage of our gas?
Well, the royal we is, on a European basis, it's very large.
Okay.
Within Ireland, it's very small. And today, the government has set a target of 5.7 terawatt hours being biomethane by 2030. What does that mean? That's 10% of Ireland's current gas usage, gas demand today.
Being biomethane.
Being biomethane. That is the objective. That's the ambition since July of last year. You might recall the debate on sectoral emissions around agricultural decarbonisation and so on. So this was one of the ambitions, and again, that was published in the budget and as a biomethane strategy in being developed by both the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine and DEC today.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, 5.7 terawatt hours representing 10% is in line with Repower EU, which is what all of the other member states signed up to. In some jurisdictions, and I'll talk about Denmark a little if I may, Colm, Denmark really established their biomethane sector in 2012. Standing start, very established gas industry.
Yeah.
And in 2012, they put a range of subsidies in place to incentivize investors and developers to get involved. And as I said earlier, 40% of their gas today is biomethane, and that's in less than 10 years. But what's really interesting a bit is that the nature of the facilities that were put in place, and companies like Nature Energy are well known in this space. They've built industrial energy complexes. These aren't sort of the back of a farm and a sort of an offshoot idea. They're really, really well managed, well maintained, odorless facilities. And certainly we think there's a market in Ireland for a small number of those large scale, well managed industrial energy complexes. And we're talking to developers in that regard.
And what would that do in terms, so you talk about the target being 10%. Are you saying that would take us then beyond that 10% target?
Well, certainly as part of that transition that I mentioned, biomethane has a really strong role to play today. It will have a very strong role to play into the long-term future as well, but it'll probably end up being used principally in transport, heavy goods transport in particular. So biomethane can then be used as a biofuel in compressed natural gas facilities. And we rolled out, we'll have 9 public stations live this year, and there are a number of private stations and private operators using compressed natural gas vehicles today. About 120 heavy goods vehicles on the roads today. But there's real momentum starting to build now around bio-CNG. Yeah. So using biomethane to power heavy goods vehicles. And that's a really important agenda for us. But certainly what we need is biomethane. We need volumes of it. We injected 41 gigawatts last year. And that's nearly 10 times what we did the year before. So it's going the right direction. Yeah. But it's still tiny in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. And what's been the barrier to biomethane production here?
So I suppose the obvious issue is government support and government policy has been delayed somewhat. There is a renewable heat obligation that's about to go into technical consultation shortly. Very welcome, very necessary. Ireland's quite behind in renewable heat targets versus Europe. I think we're running at about 6.8% or so today. Europe is 22%, so we're a good bit off the pace. So the renewable heat obligation is really important. Yeah, that's going to help. Is it enough? Our sense will be it's not. If we look at what the Danes did, they did it for 5 years. They did it to kickstart the industry. We think some real certainty and some subsidies, similar to what the wind industry would have got 20 years ago, is what's needed if we're serious about this. Okay. And I think we are serious about it.
So you see there's the potential there for significant biomethane generation. The gap is policy, which is largely around the certainty for investors if they were to put money behind these types of facilities.
It's a view, and an alternate view is, some developers will argue that it's worth it regardless of the subsidies. And certainly if I look at my own perspective and talking to the developers, I mean, we ran an event in Ballsbridge in November, late November, And we had a huge volume of people, 220 odd people in the room, from developers to off-takers to people that are genuinely interested in seeing this moving. And depending on where you are with your funding, depending on where you are with your need to access capital, having that certainty could be very important. If you, on the other hand, have another business and you're potentially, looking to reinvest or looking to diversify, that's a different investment cycle. Yeah. But to appeal to the overarching market, our sense would be more needs to be done, certainly.
Yeah, and following the path that's been followed before is an obvious thing to do in terms of, the wind energy space.
Absolutely.
So biomethane, obviously, one of the green gases that could replace fossil fuels in your network. Others that you've mentioned, hydrogen. What's your view as to how that develops?
Yeah, hydrogen is really important, and our view is that especially as we see the offshore wind and indeed onshore wind market develop further, and hopefully resolve a lot of the planning difficulties that sector is seeing. And we see some real scale, especially offshore, coming on stream. Because of the nature of renewables generally, they're intermittent. The weather is the weather, and there is times where, if an anticyclone arrives over the UK and Ireland, we don't have access to that on a constant basis. So wind using electrolysis can create hydrogen, and that hydrogen should be stored and that hydrogen should be transported. The most efficient way to transport that hydrogen is through pipeline. And certainly we're part of the European Hydrogen Backbone initiative, which is across 31 transmission operators across Europe, to build both a combination of dedicated and repurposed gas infrastructure to transport hydrogen at scale around Europe. And that hydrogen will be used from transport through to power gen. There's so many different uses for that hydrogen. We certainly would be very, very, very positive about that initiative.
And I think one of the things that the war in the Ukraine and the whole area of energy security brought home to us is, accelerating towards renewable sources of energy is the solution to our energy security. But I guess what you're talking about is in the interim period, which is going to be a long-term interim period, we need a degree of pragmatism in terms of how we might secure our energy in the interim.
Yeah, and I think, in fairness, there's been a lot of discussion around amber alerts and the idea that there could be, God forbid, blackouts or brownouts, across the electricity grid. Certainly and thankfully, and genuinely, this is a touch wood moment. We've had a very mild winter, and long may it last. Because we are absolutely at the pin of our collar when it comes to the gap between our planning around a 1 in 50 peak event and our ability to sustain the existing economy.
Maybe pin of our collar. Give me.
So if I think even most recently in December, you remember there was a cold spell mid-December. It was kind of a bit of a shock to the system. We got used to not necessarily having to wear the puffer jacket everywhere, and suddenly it got very cold. It dropped 10 degrees pretty much overnight. There were a few days there where the wind was non-existent, and we came within 1 or 2% of that 1 in 50 peak. Now, it wasn't all over the media. People are talking about lots of other things. There was almost a complacency that our energy security issues have been resolved somehow. Also because most of the infrastructure on the grid was live and running. Yeah. We'd seen outages in the previous year, but it hasn't gone away. And
so that combination of very cold weather and very calm weather puts us in a quite a vulnerable position still.
It does, and it's that perfect storm, to use the term, where you've very cold weather but you've very benign wind conditions, and that typically goes hand in hand. So in previous severe weather situations, we found that and you remember these very cold, snowy days where there's literally no wind blowing.
Yeah.
The other reality is, and this is a good thing, is that the economy is still growing. We're creating jobs. We've virtually no unemployment in the country. We've a huge amount of migrants that are seeking shelter on our shores. So all of that is driving demand. We have more people driving electric vehicles than before. So gas is rising. Demand is rising within that power gen space because electricity demand is rising, and that's an important point.
And I saw an interesting graph recently, David, which mapped GDP per capita to energy consumption per capita, and there was a very strong correlation. And the title of the graph was "There are no rich countries that don't consume a lot of energy," which again tells you that that shift to renewables is absolutely crucial, and managing that shift is crucial as well.
And I will say though, and we've seen and the government's Reduce Your Use campaign has been quite effective. We've seen a good drop off in energy use generally, and especially within gas use domestically, which is very welcome. And now the problem is it's being replaced with gas demand within the high heat industries, those hard to electrify industries, and also in power gen. So what's really welcome is people are getting it. People are absolutely mindful. They're also getting it because of the issues with the wholesale energy market prices. So people are seeing bills that they do not want. So everyone's thinking about it more than they were.
So maybe could you then describe for me, so the Gas Networks Ireland of the future looks like a very, very different organisation, but still central to the energy system here. Could you maybe just describe what that 2050 version of Gas Networks Ireland is?
Certainly, we see our role within the power gen space remaining as critical, actually, albeit we won't be, transporting natural gas to stations that are, generating electricity. It'll be hydrogen. We see a role in transport, as I mentioned earlier. Initially, biomethane and biofuels, creating bio-CNG. That'll transition to hydrogen, especially in the heavy goods vehicle sector where electrification isn't viable today. Storage is a really key agenda for us. And again, we know gas. We've been at this quite a while, as I said to you, hundreds of years, and it's a very dangerous space. The safety precautions, the regulation around all of that is something that we understand and we do very well. So that space is really important. The actual transport of the gas ain't going anywhere. The gases are changing. So we're going to be changing the gas that we're transporting, but the transport of gases is still going to be a core business for us. We're looking at other things. Like I mentioned, Aurora Telecom is a really, really thriving business. I mean, it's growing very well. Our customers in that space are delighted to be able to avail of a fibre optic solution across Ireland that is pretty much guaranteed uptime and unlimited bandwidth. Once we're providing the fibre, we're not necessarily a telco in the traditional sense. We're providing infrastructure that the likes of the big hyperscalers can use, and then they can connect to their subsea infrastructure. So really important agenda for us. And then you look at the markets of the future, the CO2 transport agenda, and one of the DSOs in Denmark, Avita, have built brand new infrastructure transporting CO2 across Denmark. So there's lots of ancillary services and options that we're looking at.
So when you boil down your capability, it's not just the pipes that go into our homes. It's an infrastructure. It's an expertise around the whole area of the storage and transportation of gases around the country, and that will be, in your view, required for centuries to come.
I think so. And the really key point, Colm, is that renewable power is where we all want to get to. Certain renewable powers have an intermittency, and that's just the reality of it. So what is the base load? What is the backup in the event? What's our marriage, if you like, when one drops off, one kicks in? Obviously, battery technology is developing. It's going to be exceptionally expensive, not to mention all of the challenges around raw materials and all that goes with that. And we're already seeing that debate coming through in the electric vehicle space. Our sense would be hydrogen will be the alternate when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. And the transport of that is our bread and butter, frankly.
So, David, this podcast is about exploring the path to Ireland's energy future, and an exciting one that is. What are you, in a couple of sentences, what are you most excited about? And if you could fix anything, what would it be? I'm
very excited about hydrogen. I would say that, wouldn't I? It is exciting because, there was the first aircraft took off this week purely powered by hydrogen. Now, lots of people will go when they hear that, because air travel is still so scary for a lot of people. But the idea that a fuel that is zero carbon, that potentially could be used in any context, is very exciting. It's funny, I recently acquired an electric vehicle, and I was blown away by the driving experience. So I'm excited about that too. The quietness of it, and the experience generally was really powerful. But overall, I would say I'm really quite excited and optimistic that the technology that's being developed to resolve our real challenges around climate change are becoming more and more visible every day. And I think being part of that and enabling it is the most exciting thing of all.
Exciting. And if you could fix one thing, what would it be?
I would certainly like to see less ideological debate and far more pragmatic debate within, not just within, the policymakers, but within discourse generally. I think certainly within media, with generally across our discourse as a nation, we're very influenced by lobby groups, by NGOs that have a very strong voice. And not enough, I don't think, is being discussed about what customers want, what people want, what they can afford, what's real. And I think I'd like to see that pragmatic discussion and debate become more apparent.
Well, hopefully podcasts like this will contribute to that. So, David, I'd like to thank you very, very much for joining me here today on KPMG's Energy Exchange podcast, where we discuss the practical things that Ireland can do to unlock the full potential of Ireland as a major energy producer. Thank you, David.